You know, in the 1850s, America's biggest political heavyweights tried to save the country. They put together these huge, grand compromises. But instead of saving the Union, all they really did was light the fuse that would eventually detonate the Civil War. So today, we're going to break down that critical decade when it all fell apart. All right, so let's set the scene. It's 1850. The country is just completely torn apart over slavery. So political giants, we're talking Henry Clay, Stephen Douglas, they get together and hammer out this massive, really complicated deal called the Compromise of 1850. And the hope, the big hope, was that this would be it, the final word, a permanent fix that would hold the country together. But it wasn't a fix, not even close. It was like gasoline on a fire. Instead of calming things down, the compromise kicked off this insane chain reaction of anger, violence, and total political collapse. So the real question is, how did a deal designed to bring peace actually make war pretty much inevitable? Let's get into it.
Well, it all starts with the simple fact that the compromise itself was built on really shaky ground. In fact, one part of it was so toxic it basically acted like a poison pill for the entire deal.
And here it is, the Fugitive Slave Act. This law completely changed the game. It dragged the issue of slavery into every single town and city across the country. I mean, all of a sudden, if you were a black person accused of being a runaway, you had basically zero legal rights. No jury. You couldn't even testify for yourself. And it meant that regular people in the North could be fined or even thrown in prison for helping someone escape. For a lot of folks, this felt like a totally outrageous abuse of federal power. And that outrage, it didn't just stay quiet. The law backfired, just spectacularly, sparking this fierce, widespread resistance all over the North. It radicalized people who, honestly, had probably been sitting on the sidelines before. And look, this wasn't some abstract political debate. 200. That's how many people, some of whom were legally free, were captured and forced into slavery because of this new law. The sight of slave catchers on the streets of cities like Boston and Chicago sparked absolute fury. This quote from Frederick Douglass really shows you the shift that was happening. The abolitionist movement had for a long time been about nonviolence. But now, faced with a law they saw as just evil, many people, including Douglass, started saying, you know what, maybe violence is the only answer here. Maybe it's legitimate self-defense. And then a cultural earthquake happened. 310,000. That's how many copies of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin sold in its first year alone. It did something no political speech could do. It brought the emotional horror of slavery right into people's living rooms, and it galvanized opposition in a way that was just completely unprecedented. So the turmoil wasn't just on the streets. It was ripping apart the very fabric of American politics. The next domino to fall was a political deal so divisive, it literally destroyed the entire two-party system as everyone knew it.
The idea that broke everything was called popular sovereignty. Now, on the surface, it sounds pretty reasonable, right? Just let the people who actually move to a new territory vote for themselves on whether to allow slavery. Super democratic. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, a lot, it turns out. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas pushes through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. His main goal was to organize all that land west of Missouri so he could get a transcontinental railroad built from his home state of Illinois. But to get Southern politicians on board, he agreed to use popular sovereignty. And here's the kicker. This act explicitly threw out the Missouri Compromise, a deal that for more than 30 years had banned slavery in that exact region. Just like that, a whole generation of political stability, gone. The political fallout was instant, and it was catastrophic. This quote from a wealthy businessman just says it all. The Whig Party, one of the two major national parties, just disintegrated. It completely collapsed because its members couldn't agree on this one act, leaving this huge power vacuum in American politics. And into that vacuum rushed a totally new kind of political party. See, these weren't like the old Whigs and Democrats, who had supporters in the North and the South. Nope. These new parties were organized almost entirely along regional and ideological lines. So you basically have two major new players emerge from the chaos. First, the Republican Party. It was a mix of different groups, but they all agreed on one single core belief. Slavery absolutely could not be allowed to expand into the Western territories. Then you had the American Party, who most people called the Know-Nothings. They were mainly an anti-immigrant party, but they also pulled in a lot of Northern voters who were against slavery. The key takeaway? The political center was just gone. So what happened when that nice, democratic-sounding idea of popular sovereignty was actually put to the test in the real world?
Well, the theory quickly devolved into a brutal, bloody conflict right there in the Kansas Territory. The territory almost immediately got a grim new nickname, Bleeding Kansas. The second the act passed, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers just poured into the territory, each side determined to win it for their cause. This was never going to be a peaceful election. The failure of the policy was just immediate and violent. Pro-slavery militias from Missouri flooded across the border to cast illegal votes. Pro-slavery forces then ransacked and burned the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. And in retaliation, the radical abolitionist John Brown and his followers dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes and murdered them. What came next was basically a miniature civil war that raged for years and cost almost 200 lives. So Congress is broken, the political parties are shattered, Kansas is literally on fire, and that's when the Supreme Court decides to step in. In 1857, it handed down a decision that it hoped would finally, once and for all, settle the slavery question. Instead, it was the final, devastating blow. The case was Dred Scott v. Sanford, and Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered the sweeping ruling that was just a total, complete victory for the South. He declared that black people, whether they were enslaved or free, were not citizens and could never be. He also ruled that Congress had absolutely no power to ban slavery in any territory, which made the old Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. And then for the final blow, he argued that any law that banned slavery was a violation of a slave owner's Fifth Amendment property rights. So why was this such a bombshell? Well, think about it. In one single decision, the Supreme Court had just declared that the central belief of the entire Republican Party, the whole reason it existed, was unconstitutional. It completely vaporized any legal path to stop the spread of slavery. The court had tried to end the debate, but what it really did was destroy any remaining middle ground. Which brings us right here to the final question. The decade started with a so-called Great Compromise that was supposed to save the Union. It ended with political parties in ruins, the Western territories bleeding, and the highest court in the land basically declaring compromise illegal. With every peaceful option off the table, was the nation now on an unstoppable collision course with war?